Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We've got another great session lined up. This one is a health, safety, and welfare credit from a very experienced presenter on a topic that is especially timely right now. As I said, you get one HSW credit for attending today's session. You'll need to have RSVP'd online via the calendar event for today's session. We've got a link in the chat coming soon so that you can do that in case you haven't already. And please stay through to the end of the session to ensure you receive your credit for today. We've got a Q&A function in the Zoom app that should be on the bottom of your screen for the interface there. If you have questions, we'll make sure to get it to Jeff either in real time if it's something you need to know about in that slide that he's presenting at the time, or we'll have time at the end. And Jeff has informed us that as he's done these, the content usually runs right at an hour. So if you've got time to stick around for more questions and details, we encourage you to do that after the top of the hour. And then we will, of course, have questions that aren't as time sensitive to the slide or the particular issue he's addressing at the time at that end of the conference. So today's session is on the restorative impact of perceived open space. And our presenter today is Jeff Northridge from Sky Factory. Welcome, Jeff. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Mr. Northridge has extensive experience in both commercial real estate and commercial construction industry. For the past 7 years, he's been developing and presenting continuing education courses on topics, including the effect of biophilic design elements on human physiology, how biophilic illusions can be created to provide many of the same physiological benefits as actual biophilic design elements, and how knowledge of the mechanics of human perception can be paired with carefully crafted illusions of nature to alter how humans experience interior spaces, something we're spending a lot of time with nowadays. He has presented Sky Factory's various AI-approved continuing education courses more than 300 times to architectural and design firms, as well as to AI chapter meetings and other events. So with that, we're pleased to have Jeff with us today, and take it away, Jeff.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that great introduction. I am glad to be back visiting Colorado, even if only virtually. I actually lived in Arvada from 1992 to 2002, and I was involved with some of the shutdown activities at the old Rocky Flats plant, if any of you are familiar with that. Good times back then. But since then, I've gone on to other things, and as Mike mentioned, I've been with Sky Factory for about 7.5 years, presenting our CEU courses. So first thing I'd like to do is thank you for your time and interest today. Very much appreciate your joining me. I am going to, I'm coming to you today from Southeast Iowa. I'm actually sitting in Sky Factory's mobile showroom. Normally I would be doing this presentation live to you. That's kind of gone by the wayside, as have a lot of things. So the showroom is actually parked by our factory in Southeast Iowa, and I'm sitting in the showroom in front of one of our products, and I'll talk more about those at the end of the presentation. But again, thank you for your time and interest, and welcome. I am going to share my slides with you guys now. So if someone can just confirm that you can see the title slide. It's red with the restorative impact on there. You guys all see that okay?
We can see it. Looks good.
Excellent. Again, welcome to our course, The Restorative Impact of Perceived Open Space. Of course, is AIA approved? If it weren't, I obviously wouldn't be here today. It's also approved by IDCEC as well as the GBCI. If any of you are lead professionals or members of the Green Building Council, you can get credit toward your general education requirements, although you will need to self-report your attendance to the GBCI. We will be providing certificates of completion for all of you, and when we email those certificates, we'll include the GBCI course number along with how to report that if you're not familiar with that process. This course is copyrighted. So please don't tell anyone anything about what we're going to talk about today, otherwise we'll have to sue you. Just kidding. We actually encourage you to share this material with clients and colleagues and anybody who you think might find it interesting. Not real sure what the attorneys are thinking about here. I'm actually not real sure what attorneys think about in general. This is the course description. Hopefully you read this when you signed up to be with us today. I am not going to read it again. There are very few things that I enjoy less than listening to someone read something from a slide. But before we get into the real heart of the course, I do want to make a few comments about the course. This course is very, what I like to say, informationally dense. I will be covering a whole lot of material. I'm going to speak pretty much for the full hour, so you know what to expect time-wise. This course has a very decided academic flavor to it. And in fact, I have gotten comments along the lines of, wow, it feels like I just sat through someone's PhD dissertation. But please do feel free to ask questions at any time. There are 3 key points that we hope you get out of the course. And I'm just going to go through these right now real quickly. And if you keep them in mind, I don't think you'll have any trouble keeping up. Point number 1 is that people like nature. When people experience nature, and that can mean anything from going camping in a national forest somewhere, at least back in the days when we used to be able to do things like that, hopefully again soon, to just going outside in the backyard for a little while after work, to even just looking out a window at a pretty green leafy tree. For most people, those kinds of experiences make them feel a little bit better. The human-nature connection and why it is that nature makes us feel good was formalized scientifically back in the mid-1980s when Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson published his book, Biophilia, and his associated biophilic hypothesis, which says simply that we humans have a subconscious need to seek out and connect with nature and other living things. So point number 1, people like nature. Point number 2, there are a lot of enclosed interior spaces in both new buildings as well as in existing buildings where it just isn't possible to bring natural light or any kind of a view to the outside into those spaces. And it's been found that people who spend extended periods of time in those kind of confined interior spaces can see negative consequences to things like their creativity, their job productivity, and even their health and well-being over extended periods of time. So point number 2, there are lots of enclosed interior spaces that are not so well suited for long-term human occupancy. Point number 3, which is really what this course is all about, we can change or modify our perception of those interior spaces to make them seem like they do have a connection to nature or they do have natural light. And we do that by staging what we call architectural cues to create illusions of nature. And it's been found that a good illusion of nature can provide many of the same psychological and physiological benefits of an actual connection to nature. So point number 3, we can modify those interior spaces to make them better suited for long-term human occupancy. These are the learning objectives. Again, I'm not going to read through them, but just a few more comments before I get into the heart of the course. I'm going to be talking a lot about what we call deep plan buildings, which are simply buildings with very large floor plates, such that a significant portion of the interior space is located more than about 3 times as far from a wall, an exterior wall, as the floor to ceiling height. Once you get that far inside of a building, even without any partition walls, natural light has dropped off to the point where, for all practical purposes, it really has no effect. These kinds of very large buildings comprise only about 2% of the total number of commercial buildings in the United States. But that's still about 100,000 total buildings. And collectively, they represent more than 1/3 of all the commercial floor stock in the country. And as our cities continue to grow, as our population continues to grow, there's an ever increasing demand for bigger and bigger buildings. So it isn't likely that the form of the deep plan building will go away anytime soon. Over the last 10 to 12 years or so, a number of lighting manufacturers have introduced what they call dynamic lighting systems. Sometimes they're called circadian lighting systems, where not only the intensity of the light, but also the color temperature can vary through the day to kind of mimic what's actually happening outside. And while it's thought that these kinds of lighting systems are a good countermeasure against what's called circadian impairment, that is, when our internal biological rhythms drift and get out of sync with the natural day-night cycle. One of the things that can happen to people who spend lots of time in enclosed interior spaces. It turns out these kinds of lighting systems really are only a partial solution, because daylight isn't just about the light, it's also about space. Okay, having said that, to start, we need to take a brief look at the physiology of the human visual system. Standard vision in the human eye consists of three basic functions: object recognition, color vision, and motion detection. We're typically not aware of these three functions separately, but combined, it's what lets us see. Light that enters our eyes is processed by specialized light-sensitive neurons in the back of the eye in the retina, called cones, which are responsible for color vision when light levels are high. We also have something called rods, which are responsible for monochromatic night vision when light levels are low. If you've ever gone outside at dusk, you've probably noticed you don't see a lot of vivid color. That's because when the light's that low, you're seeing primarily with the rods, which again, don't see any color. Up until 2002, these were the only known photoreceptors in the human eye: the red, green, and blue cones, plus the rods. But science has recently uncovered another unique sensory apparatus that's responsible for regulating our biological rhythms. It turns out there is a fifth type of photoreceptor in the inner retina with a peak sensitivity to blue light, although of a slightly different wavelength than that of the cones and the rods. These photoreceptors are known as intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. You may want to write that down for the exam. Just kidding. There will not be an exam today. That is kind of a mouthful though. So from here on out for the rest of the course, I will be referring to them as circadian photoreceptors, or maybe just circadian cells. Due to their particular sensitivity to this particular wavelength of blue light, these photoreceptors are called our physiology's blue sky detector. These circadian photoreceptors signal something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, located in the hypothalamus area of the brain, and it's known to be the body's master circadian clock. And this is something which they've always done in the environmental context of wide open space. This master biological clock, the SCN, regulates how all the cells in our bodies adjust their physiology and metabolism according to the time of day. Yet it remains to be seen whether the brain's master clock will operate the same way in the absence of a visual connection to a natural exterior space. At this time, nobody really knows for certain. This is one of those areas of ongoing research. Thus far, these circadian photoreceptors have been thought to only be concerned with irradiance, that is, overall retinal light exposure. It is not thought that they play any kind of a role in visual image formation. That's the cones and the rods. And while recent scientific studies tend to emphasize that the spatial distribution of light, that is, where in the visual field light may be coming from, does not appear to affect circadian phase resetting, at least not to the limited set of light patterns that have been tested so far. In view of other neural clues, it seems reasonable to assume that such data, again, where in the visual field light may be coming from, could play a valuable role. After all, the sun provides daylight within the context of a blue canopy, the sky, that is by its very nature spatial. Such an integrated view of our brain's neural connections and synaptic inputs would also appear to fit well with other key neuroscientific observations, which note that higher cognitive faculties like attention, memory, and planning all share the same neural infrastructure that our sensory and motor faculties use as we navigate shifting external environments. And while the relatively young field of these circadian photoreceptors may be years away from mapping all their functional roles, their interconnectedness with the rest of the visual system demonstrates the relevance of taking a holistic approach to visual phenomena. In other words, the neuroscience of visual processing has established that environmental context helps to shape cognitive perception. Studies have found that viewing the same object under different circumstances can and does influence the strength of the visual signal. So changing the environmental context of circadian light by creating a circadian effect in an enclosed interior may very well be able to trigger alertness in our physiology. But it's also equally plausible that the artificial context in which that light intensity is perceived could also trigger other less desirable cognitive or physiological responses in those enclosed interior spaces. And that's particularly true if the source of the circadian light cannot be attributed to a familiar biophilic or natural source, something that provides a recognizable spatial reference frame like the sky naturally does. While the impact of man-made circadian lighting systems is currently under study, we simply want to point out that light triggers a spatial dimension in the environment that cues our perception in ways just as fundamental and just as meaningful as the circadian impact of light itself. Leading researcher Marianne Figueroa, who is program director at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute's Lighting Research Center, has noted that the visual system relies on accurate spatial correspondence between the environment and perception. The circadian system, however, simply responds to changes in overall retinal light exposure, although it seems more responsive to light from above the line of sight, which reinforces the notion that the circadian system is a blue sky detector. Taking a different approach, the above noted observation may also indicate that humankind's hardwired blue sky detection system may not be limited to just the retina, but might also involve the brain maps created by our visual system to establish spatial correspondence between the environment, by that I mean what's really out there, and perception, what we think is out there. Those two may not be the same, as we'll see. Taking a different approach, a blue sky does not transmit circadian light to our brain on an abstract basis. It does so as humanity's most meaningful and almost visceral, if you will, experience of open space. So perhaps in addition to mimicking the circadian oscillations of daylight in enclosed interiors, another equally important component is the spatial context in which light intensity is transmitted. What I mean here by spatial context or environmental context is what other things are surrounding the particular object that I'm looking at, in this case, a source of light. If I look up at a standard recessed can lighting fixture, for example, it's very obvious to me that that's an artificial source of light. But if we take a bigger fixture, say a standard 2x4 troffer, and we recess that up in the ceiling a few inches, and then we put a diffuser panel in front to even out the light, and we put a translucent photograph of sky and clouds in front of that, now it's not so obvious that that's an artificial source of light. It could reasonably be interpreted as being a natural source of light. That's what I mean by the spatial context or the environmental context. So if not the actual sky itself, then an illusion of overhead sky or an illusion of a natural environment that is sufficiently credible to match our biophilic memory, that is, our genetic memory of the same stimuli, looking up at the sky in this case, under similar conditions, may be of significant importance. In order to understand the spatial correspondence between the environment, again, what's really out there, and perception, what we think is out there, we need to take a closer look at the relationships between light, space, and memory. Research in neuroscience has recently uncovered a fascinating connection between our ability to map space and memory, a fundamental building block involved in giving rise to environmental context. According to Jennifer Groh, who is a professor at Duke University and author of the book, Making Space, How the Brain Knows Where Things Are, it turns out that not only is memory an integral part of building a sense of space, but space in turn serves as a kind of filing system for storing and accessing memories. And the brain's memory-space connection relies on shared neural infrastructure. Many parts of our brains process more than one kind of information. Some areas do it sequentially, other areas do it concurrently. This is one of those shared areas. This insight provides one of the clues that may answer the mystery behind why certain optical illusions, what we term biophilic illusions of nature in this course, which provide a spatial reference frame, can have such a unique impact on our psychophysiology in comparison to standard or just plain representational nature art photography. When we provide a visual stimulus that mimics a spatial relationship that we're familiar with, the brain's sensory and motor regions react as if the original memory itself was being re-experienced. This is consistent with a unique facet of illusions. They're capable of conjuring an experience when key cognitive cues emulate an actual past experience. While our circadian rhythm signals various internal biological clocks, given the shared neural infrastructure between memory and spatial cognition, it seems reasonable to assume that our most universal sense of space, which would be the sky, would also be an effective circadian synchronizer as it relates to the effects of daylight on our physiology. After all, our own experience confirms we intuitively gravitate to nature and open space because our senses tend to come alive, enticed in ways that no man-made environment can mimic without overstimulation or sensory overload. Consider, for example, being out in the forest. For most people, this is a relaxing and refreshing experience. But there is a huge amount of visual information out there. Tiny little details in the bark on the trees, lots of little insects crawling around, huge numbers of pine needles, leaves, and branches. And as those rustle in the breeze, light patterns from the sun are continually shifting. Just a tremendous amount of visual information there. Yet most people find that to be a very restorative and relaxing experience. Compare that to being in New York City, in Times Square, thinking about crossing the street. Now, there's a lot of visual information here as well, to be sure, although not nearly as much as there is out in the forest. Yet most people wouldn't consider this to be a relaxing experience. Many people would find it rather stressful. The difference is the visual information is man-made instead of being natural. Research has found that open space can literally deepen human thought. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little and moving into the second part of the course, let's take a look at what we call the hidden cost of enclosed interiors. According to the Institute for Building Efficiency, over 50% of all the commercial buildings that will still be in use by the year 2050 have already been built. In other words, a large percentage of the workforce can be expected to work in outmoded buildings for the next 30, 40, 50, or more years. Furthermore, a 2010 survey by the U.S. Energy Information Administration found that nearly 3/4 of the floor stock in the U.S., equivalent to 46 billion square feet, belong to buildings over 20 years old, before the principles of biophilic design were well understood, let alone widely applied. For any of you who may not be familiar with the term biophilic design, this is a simplification, but what that means basically is bringing nature into the built space, incorporating lots of windows, skylights, atriums, natural materials, natural finishes, live plants where possible. This is an example of biophilic design kind of taken to the maximum. Lots of sunlight, lots of natural light, actual living green carpet consisting of actual grass, live plants. Again, that's a bit of a simplification, but that's kind of what biophilic design is all about. So these figures can only mean that while the benefits of green design, biophilic design, and sustainable technologies are more and more being incorporated into new buildings, the pressing question is, what solutions are available for billions of square feet of completely or partially enclosed interiors that will continue to be used for decades to come? How can we create sustainable interiors for long-term human occupancy in older buildings that are not optimal for human performance and health? I'd like to take a quick look at a survey that was done a few years ago in the healthcare sector related to the highest level of LEED certification, LEED Platinum. In 2015, the Journal of Hospital Administration published an article that examined the relationship between hospital environments and employee engagement, turnover, illness, and injury. The study concluded that employees' perceptions of the interior environment do impact their engagement, health, and well-being. But the study also found that deficiencies in building design, even for LEED Platinum projects, was still very apparent. One of the criteria for achieving a LEED Platinum certification is 75% daylight penetration. And while the study found that the LEED Platinum hospitals did have a lot of daylight, it tended to be found in places like patient rooms, public corridors, cafeterias, gift shops, places where patients, their visitors, and the public spent time. Not so much where the hospital staff had their offices and work areas. Those tended to be found in the centers of buildings and in lower levels of multi-story buildings, and were notably devoid of daylight. The study also looked at some physical differences in the layouts between LEED Platinum and non-LEED facilities, and it concluded by saying that future design of facilities would benefit from careful analysis of layout and organization of spaces with consideration to employee work processes. So it could be said that in this particular case anyway, LEED has led not. Sorry, that's kind of a bad pun, I know. So in fact, we may find that as long as deep plan buildings continue to exist, and again, I don't see them going away anytime soon for reasons discussed earlier, the solution to their detrimental effects may not be found within their walls as much as within our perception of those surfaces, walls and ceilings, as spatial boundaries, our perception of those surfaces. This change in emphasis allows us to consider new visual spatial technologies within the context of existing less than ideal working environments. In order to fully understand this, we need to take a brief look at environmental design and some of the mechanics of human perception. The field of neuroscience has done much to uncover how our visual system makes inferences and fills in the gaps from missing or misleading visual input. Our brain routinely makes assumptions about sensory input, and this confirms that our perception is born of a process of interpretation, not so much the static transmission of one-to-one correlations from environmental cues. An example is this slide. When you first looked at this, some of you may have seen spirals, others may have seen interlocking circles. In fact, it's just 4 concentric circles. It can be said that the rich tapestry of visual experience that we cognize, to get a little bit poetic, is actually an internal composite presented by our senses and subsequently organized by the internal algorithms used by our brains to interpret and give rise to meaningful perceptions. Psychologists call this process our habits of perception. There are people, aside from psychologists, who make understanding these habits of perception their business. They know how we are used to seeing things, they know how we expect to see things, and they use that knowledge to create for us realities that don't really exist. Anybody know the kinds of people that I'm talking about? Magicians. Not too long ago in the course, someone suggested politicians. I think that's also another very good answer. This phenomenon, according to neuroscientists Stephen Macknick and Susanna Martinez Conde, authors of a very interesting book called Sleights of Mind, is an unavoidable result born of the sheer limitations in the number of neurons and neural connections underlying our sensory and mental processes. What they're saying, as powerful as it is, and it's still a lot more powerful than even the most powerful supercomputers we've been able to build, still just doesn't have enough computing power to do a full, accurate 100% mapping of the space that we occupy. By the way, I recommend this book. It's a fun and entertaining read. They get into the neuroscience of magic. Spoiler alert though, they do reveal how a number of very well-known magic tricks are done. So if you like going to see magicians and you don't want to know how they do the tricks, then don't read the book. Otherwise, I recommend it. We're accustomed to the notion that our perception of reality, of what is out there, is accurate, but this simply is not true. For example, here we see what appears to be 3 very well-formed rows of text. The letters all seem to be the same height. The lines all appear to be perfectly lined up. Yet if we shift where we're standing by a little bit, now they don't look quite so well formed. In fact, they actually look pretty distorted. Here, the context of what we see depends on where we stand. Our visual circuits are not passive transmitters of sensory input, but actively amplify, suppress, converge, and diverge all incoming visual information, to use the author's own words. They go further and assert you perceive what you see as something different from reality. Perception means resolving ambiguity. And they go on to provide another great example that we're all very familiar with. Why does the full moon look so big as it first rises above the horizon? Yet when we see it high up in the sky, it appears to be much smaller. The discrepancy in perceived size is primarily due to the influence down near the horizon, adjacent to hills, trees, buildings, telephone poles, whatever. Our brain actually enlarges the size of the lunar disk that we see based on these environmental or contextual cues. But high up in the sky, with only the vastness of the open sky to provide context, our visual circuits actually reduce its perceived size. Now, full disclosure here, if you measure the size of the moon when it's down near the horizon and then measure it again high up in the sky, it will measure slightly bigger down near the horizon due to the effects of something called atmospheric lensing. But the difference is actually pretty minimal, and it's not something you'd normally notice. So again, the difference that you do see is primarily because of context. Which size is true? Well, it's kind of hard to say. These are just a few examples of how our perception is not as static as we believe it to be, but is a dynamic process sensitive to the environmental cues surrounding visual input. Furthermore, scientists have been able to categorize what we would recognize as attention, our ability to direct our focus, not as a single and uniform phenomenon, but as a number of discrete cognitive processes. Of particular relevance to environmental design and the mechanics involved in how we experience a given space is the cognitive phenomenon known as the spotlight of attention. The ability to regulate sensory input by bearing down onto a particular region of visual space, while at the same time tuning out data or stimuli that fall outside that tunnel vision of focus. This is not limited to just our vision. Some of you may have heard of something called the cocktail party effect. We can be in a room with 50 other people, all having conversations between themselves, and we have the ability to pick out, follow, and understand a single conversation between two people in that room while tuning out all the other conversations. When we direct our focus to a given area, our spotlight of attention falls on what is called retinotopic space. As the neuroscientists explain, neurons from higher levels of your visual system increase the activation of the low-level circuits and enhance their sensitivity to sensory input. At the same time, neurons in the surrounding regions of visual space are actively inhibited. I think this same process probably also explains what my wife refers to as my selective hearing. It's interesting to note that another neuroscientist, Dr. Steve Rose, author of The Future of the Brain, notes a fascinating study where the perceived sensory input actually increases when the context changes. That is, the same visual stimulus presented under a different context does in fact lead to a more, or sometimes less, engaging cognitive experience. Dr. Rose believes that this is the stuff of which unexpected illusions are made. In one of his lectures discussing his book, Dr. Rose wonders what is wrong with the world around us, considering that clinical depression, which the World Health Organization has called the epidemic of the 21st century, has become the malign of humanity. Considering what we now know about the importance of multisensory stimuli and environmental context, Dr. Rose asks the question, could the unprecedented global spike in clinical depression have an architectural origin? Kind of a profound question. Could the lack of a neurologically complex environment, which is the hallmark of visual access to nature, coupled with the wholesale migration to static artificial interiors that provide little sensory stimuli, be largely responsible for this dramatic change in modern humanity's psychological well-being and even our neural chemistry? Instead of living and working in natural environments, a substantial percentage of the population labors within intricate, labyrinth-like buildings in high-density metropolitan areas. Nothing really could be further disassociated from our innate biophilic need for open space. The healing canopy of open skies. Okay, tell the truth. Didn't this slide make you feel a little bit better when it came up after the last several? The healing canopy of open skies, one of the circadian synchronizers that help entrain or reset our circadian rhythm, is the spatial connection that artificial interiors must account for if they're to support occupants who spend the majority of their workday within their walls. When our senses are immersed in a natural environment, we experience what's called biophilic engagement. Our physiology relaxes while our mind remains alert. This is known as the automatic relaxation response. It's the opposite of the fight or flight response and every bit as instinctual. When we're stressed and fatigued, our productivity plummets, and enclosed interiors have been found to magnify stress as well as magnify both anxiety and fatigue. To alleviate these symptoms, we must learn how to elicit that biophilic engagement in confined artificial environments. While cognition itself is a complex subject, it's enough to note that human spatial cognition is fundamental to human life. By spatial cognition, neuroscientists Roger Hart and Gary Moore refer to the internalized reflection and reconstruction of space in thought. Over the past 30 years or so, the field of evidence-based design has taken a prominent role in studying the environmental features most conducive to a healing environment, building a knowledge base during that time that now guides architectural design in healthcare settings. For any of you who may not be familiar with the term evidence-based design, again, this is a bit of a simplification, but what that means is scientifically and rigorously studying which environmental features in a space aid and contribute to patient recovery, healing, and general wellness, which environmental features may detract from patient recovery, healing, and wellness, and in trying to include as many of the positive features while minimizing the number of negative features to the maximum extent practical. Again, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's kind of what evidence-based design is all about. Over this period, healthcare researchers and designers have embraced the benefits of nature art imagery in providing what are called positive distraction features in clinical settings. When someone goes to the doctor or the hospital, frequently they're stressed. They feel bad, they don't know why, that's why they're going to the hospital, or maybe they do know why. Maybe they've been diagnosed with cancer or some other horrible disease. It's been found that views of nature, whether an actual nature view out through a real window or nature photography or even nature-inspired art, can give those patients something that they can put their attention on to distract them, if you will, from whatever it is that they're stressing about. Interestingly enough, though, until fairly recently, neither the designers of nature art imagery nor the researchers involved in documenting the clinical properties of nature art have considered the cognitive implications of introducing a more profound phenomenon, that of visual illusions, into healthcare settings. Virtual skylights are such visual illusions. When properly designed, they give rise to a powerful architectural tool, again, what we call biophilic illusions of nature, that incorporate materials and techniques ranging from art and photography to filmmaking and architecture. Taken together, they become an artistic tool and a unique image technology that can engage our cognitive organs in such a way that our hardwired habits of perception experience something else. It's almost like they can transport us out of those enclosed interior spaces. They're able to induce a restorative experience of biophilic engagement in enclosed interior spaces. Such a visual design framework would need to factor how we process multisensory stimuli. Unlike standard commercial photography, which does not require any kind of context, images designed as visual illusions reinforce the environmental context of their surroundings, an attribute that permits them to engage spatial cognition. Imagery that incorporates an architectural context triggers a deeper therapeutic response, not just psychological, but a broader neurophysiological response to the perceived change in the surroundings. The actual surroundings haven't changed, but our perception of them has. Illusions of natural environments lead the observer's physiology to experience a visceral sensation of openness that can and does have meaningful restorative benefits. After several years of noting recurrent patient experiences of vastness, that is, a palpable sensation of openness when exposed to biophilic illusions in enclosed clinical environments, it became evident that looking at the neuroarchitecture of how such illusions are perceived could be very illuminating. A few years ago, Texas Tech University's College of Human Sciences and their Neuroimaging Institute spearheaded a study that was subsequently published in the peer-reviewed academic journal Health Environments Research and Design. The Texas Tech study was designed to uncover the neural pathways involved in the perception of open sky photographic compositions as compared to how other known positive, negative, and neutral images were perceived. What the researchers did for this study, they used a technology called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, to map electrical activity in the brains of test subjects as they were shown a series of different photographs. Some of the images were selected to evoke a positive emotional response and activate those areas of the brain known to neuroscience for processing positive content. Pictures of cute puppies and kittens, butterflies, other kinds of cute animals, and pleasant nature scenes. Some of the images were selected to evoke a negative emotional response and activate those areas of the brain, different areas, responsible for processing negative content. These were pictures of things like forest fires, garbage dumps, dead animals, ugly insects. Some of the images were selected not to evoke any kind of an emotional response at all. Close-up of a sheet of plywood, close-up of a brick wall. And some of the images were carefully composed open sky photographic compositions. This study earned Best International Research Project of 2014 at the Design and Health International Academy Awards for shedding light on the neuroarchitecture of functional illusions of nature. And in 2017, the study also earned a Certificate of Research Excellence from the Environmental Design Research Association, EDRA. EDRA created the CORE Awards a number of years back to recognize outstanding practice-based research, which has a somewhat different set of evaluative criteria as pure academic research. It's actually a very prestigious award. The award-winning study revealed that specifically designed open sky photographic compositions can be deliberately framed not only to share the same characteristic neural activations present in positive images. Again, these are nature images that are known to elicit a positive emotional response in the brain, but also engage areas of the brain involved in spatial cognition. Of particular interest to the researchers were activations they found in the cerebellum, as it's often associated with aspects of moving through space and depth perception. This surprised the researchers. Never before had they seen activity in the cerebellum when showing people static, non-moving, two-dimensional photographs. This was something new. The positive impact of nature images on health outcomes has been traditionally measured using behavioral and physiological indicators, which has left much to be understood about the neural mechanisms that explain their positive influence. The Texas Tech study was a step towards such understanding. There's actually a lot of ongoing research. not just at Texas Tech, but at several other universities here in the US, as well as in Europe and Japan. So with a neurological understanding of the power that biophilic illusions have to alter perceived space, indoor spaces can leverage a research-based approach to mitigate the deleterious impact of deep plan buildings. With such tools, isolated areas can be adapted to provide healthy, biophilic, and restorative interiors for human occupancy. There's a growing interest in studying these biophilic illusions to pinpoint how they mitigate the consequences of spending lots of time inside in enclosed interiors. These illusions emerge from an amalgam or combination of different environmental cues. Among these are the fidelity and quality of the reproduced visual content. That is, how good is the photograph? The seamless integration of those visual elements into an appropriate architectural context, whether that's something that looks like it might be part of a skylight, as you see here, or maybe a backlit landscape photograph recessed into the wall with something around it looking like a window frame, maybe even with some drapes or blinds or curtains, and the manipulation of light intensity and color temperature, which all collectively combine to synthesize a new perception of space. In situations when an interior space cannot incorporate an actual visual connection to nature, we can mimic the geometry of natural environments by reproducing two fundamental biophilic spatial relationships within the architectural framework of those interior spaces. The first of these spatial relationships is the perceived zenith. That's the point going straight up above our heads where we perceive the space we occupy to end. When we're inside, that's typically the ceiling plane, a few feet to maybe a few tens of feet above our heads. When we're outside, it's generally much higher, tree branches, clouds, the sky. As an example of how strongly the perceived zenith can actually affect how we feel, think back to the last time you had a really busy day in the office. Maybe you had a major client deadline that was due the next morning. You came in early. You worked through the whole morning at your desk without leaving. You had a very quick lunch. You worked through the whole afternoon, again, with no breaks. You stayed late. You ground through it, and you finally got everything done. Think back to how you felt that evening as you left the building on your way home. If you're like most people, as you walked out the front door, when your perceived zenith went from a point a few feet above your head to a point much higher up, you very likely felt an almost palpable sense of decompression and relief as you walked out the door. The other of these spatial relationships is the perceived horizon line, where we perceive the sky to meet the ground or the sea. As an example of how strongly this can affect us, consider airplane pilots who find themselves flying in clouds. They report that to be an extremely disorienting experience. And in fact, without their flight instruments, they literally cannot tell which way is up or down. They can't tell if they're ascending or descending. And in fact, some pilots have crashed their planes by flying into the ground if they've had instrument malfunctions and aren't sufficiently trained. Mountain climbers, similarly, if they're climbing a mountain and they lose a visual connection to the horizon, they too report that to be very disorienting. Even though they can see the ground, they can feel which way is up and down. Without that visual connection to the horizon, they find it disorienting enough that they will frequently stop climbing the mountain, set up camp, and wait for the weather to clear before going on up the rest of the mountain. In any environment, inside or outside, natural or artificial, the zenith and the horizon line serve as environmental anchors that shape our experience of space. We cannot underestimate the importance of visual input and spatial awareness to our well-being. When we have our eyes open, vision accounts for 2/3 of the entire electrical activity of the brain, a full 2 billion of the 3 billion total neural firings per second. In fact, more than half of all the neural tissue in our bodies is directly or indirectly related to vision. Both our frontal vision and our peripheral vision work together to automatically map out the space we occupy. But our psychophysiological relationship to space is much more than a simple mechanical mapping function. Environmental psychologists have suggested that human beings perceive a strong relationship between the space that surrounds them and the passage of time. Research has shown that larger spaces tend to slow perceived time, whereas smaller spaces tend to speed up perceived time. This relationship reveals some interesting dynamics. It may in part explain why we find deadlines to be so much more looming while we're sitting at our desks working. We're in a relatively small space, our perception of time speeds up, we start getting very anxious that we're not going to have enough time to finish working on whatever it is that we're working on. When we feel our body, which is our entrained measure of scale, to be smaller in relation to the space we occupy, we literally perceive time to slow down. This has been observed clinically, and it echoes the scale proportions found in views to nature that offer something called prospect and refuge, where we have unimpeded visual and spatial access out into an expansive natural environment from some small secure spot, like a balcony or a scenic or a secluded outlook. Given this recurrent scale relationship, it's not surprising that panoramic views of nature remain a hallmark of ideal aesthetic design. As a matter of fact, some neuroscientists, like Jennifer Groh, speculate that abstract thought is intimately linked to spatial cognition, and the way we map out our sense of space may also be responsible for the very nature of human thought itself. Another very profound insight. In her book, Making Space, How the Brain Knows Where Things Are, Dr. Groh asserts that much of the information stored in our memory systems is intrinsically spatial. We find things by remembering where to look, and many of the brain's sensory and motor regions also exhibit memory-related activity. She goes on to remark that the parietal cortex, another part of the brain located in that hypothalamus region, seems to play a role in unlocking memories by calling to mind spatial frame references based on one's imagined perspective on the scene. She goes on to give a fascinating example from a 1978 study done by a couple of Italian researchers who tested patients who suffered from damage to one side or the other of their parietal cortex on how well they could recall familiar settings. The researchers asked their patients to imagine themselves standing at the foot of the famous Piazza del Duomo in Milan, Italy, and to name as many landmarks from around that square as they could. They found the patients had trouble naming landmarks from the side of the square corresponding to the damaged part of their parietal cortex. For example, some of their patients were not able to recall the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele, which for Italians is one of the best known landmarks in their entire country. It's as well known to them as the Statue of Liberty or Mount Rushmore would be to an American. The fascinating discovery came when the researchers asked their patients to switch mental perspectives and imagine themselves standing at the other end of the square facing back the opposite direction. The change in vantage point, even though it was only imagined, now allowed those patients to recall landmarks from the side of the square that they previously couldn't. Now they could remember the Galleria. So those memories were there all along. Conscious access to those memories was only a matter of recreating the proper spatial reference frame in the mind's eye of those patients. Interesting study. In similar fashion, when we create visual stimuli in enclosed interiors with the proper spatial frame reference, and again, that's a design element that's unique to illusions of nature and not found in standard decorative photography, we are able to reestablish a neural connection to our past experiences of looking up at the sky. These neural dynamics indicate the central role that spatial reference frames play in channeling stored biophilic memories of spatially similar experiences. And it may also explain why even a fairly small simulated skylight inside of a building can also evoke that same relaxation response that open natural environments are so easily able to reveal. These assertions provide a neurological basis to understand why natural environments have played such a fundamental role in the development of our neural circuitry, and why now, more than ever, when urban humankind's daily experience is one of limited built space rather than natural open space, the negative consequences to our cognitive functions, like performance and wellness, cannot be stressed enough. With the modern march toward limited disconnected space, society has seen the rise of urban pathologies, most notably hypertension, chronic stress, and attention deficit affective disorder. It's interesting to note, though, these acquired behaviors all tend to lose much of their neurotic hold when the subject is immersed in a larger spatial frame of reference, like a natural exterior space. In the case of interior spaces, we can extend the interior zenith using a multisensory illusion that passes through the ceiling plane. We can establish a perceived zenith beyond the ceiling. Such an illusory zenith not only provides visual information, but also engages our vestibular system, thereby incorporating our sense of balance and spatial orientation to reinforce the new spatial reference frame. A multisensory approach to image composition, among other elements of design, is fundamental to creating a successful and credible illusion. The combined environmental cues tie the overhead image to its architectural context, thereby making the boundaries of the ceiling transparent, if you will, to both the eye and the awareness of the observer. The suggestive quality of the environmental cues, image composition, and light quality, all married to an appropriate architectural context, can similarly weaken the boundaries of interior walls. So in summary, these two spatial relationships, the perceived zenith and the perceived horizon line, together represent a new visual and cognitive technology that's just begun to be leveraged in deep plan interiors. It's particularly useful when other avenues to bring biophilic design relief indoors are not structurally possible or economically feasible. By taking this cognitive framework into account in the visual design process, it's possible to have a research-based visual technology that can be used to transform literally billions of square feet of enclosed interiors into comfortable, healthy, and restorative indoor spaces that are much better suited for long-term human occupancy. Okay, told you guys it was going to be informationally dense. Let me switch my screen back to where you guys can see me. And I guess if there are any questions, before I take questions, I invite you all to visit our website, the Sky Factory website. We started our company back in 2002, specifically to create these illusions of nature: simulated skylights, simulated windows, simulated aquariums, both static image as well as moving image, to give you as designers some tools that can be used to transform the experience of enclosed interior spaces. Visit our website. There's lots of information about our products, lots of pictures of actual installations, Our image library is online. There's a lot of other educational material. Please do check us out. Okay, looks like we've got some questions in the chat window.
Jeff, you might want to say what that website is, by the way, so people can look up the URL.
Good suggestion, Mike. Thank you. It's just www.skyfactory.com. Our company is Sky Factory, website skyfactory.com. Please do check us out. Don't hesitate if you have a project where you think you might want to recommend something like this to your clients. Give us a call at our main Sky Factory number. If you just Google Sky Factory, you'll find us. Ask to speak with one of our Sky designers. We have a group of people whose job it is to work with you. They can give you advice if you want it. Once you figure out exactly what product and what shape, size, and configuration you want to recommend, they can give you an exact to the penny price quote, including shipping and handling, so you know exactly what to take back to your clients.
We had a question from an attendee that was interested in getting a list of the books referenced in the talk.
If you visit our website, skyfactory.com, in the upper right part of the website, there is a tab that says Education. If you click on that and come down, the 5th or the 6th thing down in that tab is a white paper, same title as this course, The Restorative Impact of Perceived Open Space. You can download that white paper completely free of charge. It is fully footnoted with a complete bibliography, references to all of the books, studies, and papers that I talked about during this course. There's actually a lot of material in the white paper that didn't make it into the course due to time constraints. So if you're interested in further reading, that's a great place to start. And again, it's got references and links to everything that I talked about. Thank you.
Sure. I'm curious if you're seeing more applications of this in new construction or renovation.
It's split pretty evenly for us. In new healthcare construction, we do quite a bit of business. Actually, probably 2/3 of our total business, maybe as much as 70%, is into healthcare and related fields. New construction, we do a lot of business in healthcare. As far as renovations, a lot of workplaces, office spaces, Fortune 500 companies, things like that. Some retail. Education is kind of split between new construction. In a new school, typically they'll use these products in places like cafeterias, libraries, hallways. Renovations of some of the older, those monolithic brick school buildings that were built back in the 40s and 50s that have interior classrooms with no windows. We've done some actual in-classroom installs in those kinds of facilities. So it's kind of split, mixed bag on that.
Mm-hmm. And how would a designer who is assembling an energy model factor this in? Do you have calculations for like what the load of the backlighting or the display technology would be?
Typically for our static image skylights, they generally come in 2x2 and 2x4 sizes for our original skylight, the one that's compatible with a grid-based ceiling system. About 22 watts for a 2x2 panel, 33 watts for a 2x4. In most code jurisdictions in the country, not all, but most, these kinds of products do not count toward your lighting energy budget. They're considered to be specialty art kinds of products. There are a few code jurisdictions in California and a few in New York, and there may be some others where these products do count toward your energy budget. So the thing to do would be to check with your local code authority and find out exactly how they treat it. But chances are good that in Colorado, they're not counted in the energy budget. But just as a rule of thumb, 22 to 33 watts for a 2x4 or a 2x2 or a 2x4 panel. So about 7 watts per square foot.
I assume there's an extensive image catalog of things that people can specify, but what can they do custom as well?
We absolutely can. Sky Factory does almost all of our own photography in-house. We actually have 2 full-time photographers. Those guys have a tough job. We're sending them out to scenic spots all over the country. Our image library is online, literally thousands of photographs of sky and clouds and landscapes. close to 100 videos for our video-based products. If you have a client who has a favorite local scenic spot and we don't have something, we're happy to send one of our photographers out to shoot that. Lately, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been able to more and more accept customer supplied photography. With the current state of the art in digital photography, for not a lot of money now, you can get a digital camera that does a really good job. So we're happy to take a look at that. If it meets our requirements as far as image quality and resolution, we're happy to use customer supplied photography.
What's the lead time on one of these from the manufacturing side?
We build every product that goes out the door on a custom basis. So we don't maintain a stock of assembled skylights and windows. For a standard size, standard shape, typically 4 weeks for the static image products, 6 weeks for the video-based products, 8 weeks if you want to do a custom shape, if you wanted to do a big kidney-shaped skylight, and we haven't done that particular shape configuration before, 8 weeks. Now, having said that, we also recognize that frequently your client is not going to know that this is going to fit into the budget until less than 4 weeks before the ceiling contractors are supposed to come in. We very frequently can beat that. If you think there's a possibility that your client may want to do something, obviously we appreciate knowing early so we can plan for that potential. But the quickest I know of that we turned a product around was we got an order on a Wednesday afternoon and we shipped the next day. Literally, we built that product for that customer that evening and shipped it out the next morning. So we very frequently can beat an accelerated shipping table if necessary.
Is there an added cost if you use a customer supplied image?
No.
And what about for like a non-standard shape installation?
Typically, it will drive the cost up a little bit. The base cost is about $170 per square foot. So for a 2x2 skylight, which would be our smallest standard size, you're at about 650, maybe 700 bucks. A 2x4, approximately 1250 to 1300. So a 4x6 rectangular skylight, probably our most common size, you're a little bit less than 4,000 bucks. For a custom shape, if you wanted a big, Pac-Man shaped sky ceiling, it will end up being a little bit more per square foot just to cover the engineering costs for building a product that unique, but it doesn't really add all that much. Again, best thing to do is call and talk to one of our sky designers. They can give you an exact to the penny quote for whatever you're thinking about.
You might have some added installation costs on those custom sizes too, because I imagine
could be.
Your standard sizes are going to be not that unusual for a ceiling installer from doing like an Armstrong or a USG type acoustical system. So
if you're doing a custom shape, and a kidney shaped skylight, for example, going into a suspended grid ceiling system, obviously there is, how do you interface that kidney shape with the rectilinear grid? So yeah, typically the installation will be a little bit more complicated. Whereas to just put a 4x6 in, it's pretty much a direct replacement for the acoustic tiles.
And is there any particular scheduling notes that people need to know about with the trades? Like, does it all happen when the ceiling crew is on site, or must there be some consideration for the mechanical and plumbing guys for sprinkler location or electrical?
Generally, you will need an electrician to connect, provide power for the lighting systems, which, and that can be 120 or 277 or whatever your lighting voltage is. It's definitely good to coordinate with your sprinkler and your mechanical people, so you don't come in to install the skylight and find you've got an HVAC duct running 3 inches above the tiles right where you were thinking of putting the ceiling. So we definitely do recommend planning early in the design process and coordinating with those other trades. Absolutely.
Well, you're the answer, man. You've got all the questions for anything I could think of and anything our attendees could think of. Really insightful presentation today. My brain kept switching between fight or flight mode, it was mostly off of that because of the very restorative natural images that you were able to share. But it did hurt my brain a little bit to get all that information. But
There was a lot of information there. We recognize that.
yeah,
But
really
appreciate everyone hanging in there. And thanks again for your time and your interest. And I hope all of you are able to stay healthy, safe, and sane in these rather insane times that we all seem to be living in right now.
indeed.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Jeff. And a couple notes before we close out. To ensure you receive your HSW credit for today's session, please put your full name in the chat function. Also make sure you RSVP via that calendar link that's at the front end of the chat and as you scroll there. Tomorrow we've got a session coming up, same time, on how local governments are changing their processes for permitting and inspections and plan reviews in this new environment. Next week, we've got 2 sessions back-to-back on Tuesday and Wednesday, all about the economics of the situation that we're in and how to navigate those. The first one will be from a business consultant who's had a lot of experience and insight on this. And the second will be from firm owners and principals and other folks that have navigated recessions before. So we look forward to seeing you in the future. And we thank Jeff Northridge and Sky Factory again for his great presentation today. Thanks and take care.